Have you ever wondered what happens when ambition, a force that drives us forward, becomes an obsession that consumes us? What if the desire to mold one's own destiny, to rewrite reality according to one's own will, costs an individual their very essence, unraveling the deepest bonds of their humanity? Prepare for an introspective and somber journey, where we will delve into the mind of an enigmatic figure who challenged the limits of the possible, a charismatic leader where nobility and vision converge with a psychological precipice of epic proportions. What you are about to witness will fundamentally change your perception of power, leadership, and the unimaginable cost of attaining it. In the heart of a kingdom plagued by incessant conflicts, widespread misery, and a seemingly immutable social structure, a young man of singular brilliance emerges, Griffith. His arrival on the scene felt almost prophetic, for from an early age, his presence exuded a magnetic charisma, an aura of natural leadership that drew everyone to him, from the most despairing to the most ambitious. He wasn't merely a dreamer amidst the darkness, he was an architect of futures, a born strategist who saw paths to glory where others found only dead ends and disillusionment. The environment in which Griffith developed, a cauldron of extreme social inequalities and continuous battles for survival, forged in him an unwavering conviction, the necessity of transcending the limitations imposed by the world, of redefining his own place and that of his followers. His psyche, from the earliest traces of his youth, showed signs of high self-efficacy, an unshakable belief in his ability to influence events and achieve goals that seemed impossible to many. It wasn't just youthful optimism, but an internal, almost premonitory conviction that his destiny was firmly in his hands, and that he possessed not only the tools but the iron will to forge it. This self-efficacy, combined with a grandiose and almost messianic vision of his place in the world and his future, planted the seeds of an ambition that, at first glance, appeared to be merely a virtue, the virtue of a born leader. He founded a group, the Band of the Falcon, attracting loyal followers with the promise of a better future, of a kingdom where hope wasn't just a distant whisper, but a tangible reality. The camaraderie that formed, the bonds forged on bloody battlefields and in shared dreams beneath the night sky, seemed indestructible, a solid foundation upon which a new world would be built. However, amidst all this brilliance and promise, there was something subtle, almost imperceptible, that no one saw coming, a faint fissure in the foundation of his soul. The turning point, the crucial moment that would forever alter Griffith's trajectory, arrived brutally and unexpectedly. After a series of seemingly invincible triumphs that appeared to solidify his meteoric ascent, a cataclysmic event shook the very foundations of what he had built. A cruel twist of fate, an overwhelming ordeal that stripped him of his freedom, his dignity, and cast him into an abyss of despair and prolonged physical and mental torment. This wasn't merely a military or political setback, it was a devastating psychological trigger that forced Griffith to confront the intrinsic fragility of his existence, the vulnerability of his most audacious dreams, and the ineffectiveness of his own strength in the face of destiny. During this period of forced confinement and prolonged torment, the transformation, once a murmur, began to manifest itself painfully and irreversibly. Ambition, which was once a powerful and directed engine, became a ravenous and distorted obsession, consuming every fiber of his being. He began to show clear signs of severe cognitive distortion, where external reality was incessantly reinterpreted and reshaped to justify his deepest, unconfessable desires, seeking a new coherence amidst the chaos. The internal conflict was palpable, a silent battle between the altruistic idealist he had been and the relentless pragmatist he was becoming. Externally, his absence and the impact of the ordeal generated uncertainty, fragility, and a growing fear among his followers, who struggled desperately to keep the flame of his original vision alive. Psychology would explain this drastic transformation through the concept of learned helplessness, where prolonged experience of limited control over one's life and body, often accompanied by intense suffering, can lead to a radical re-evaluation of coping strategies. For Griffith, however, the loss of absolute control over his destiny did not result in passive resignation. Instead, it triggered a drastic intensification of his will to dominate, an iron, almost supernatural determination to never again be subjugated, to ensure that he would be the sole architect of his own reality, no matter the cost. And it was there, in that dungeon of pain and darkness, that everything began to crumble, paving the way for something far grander and more terrifying. Griffith's mind, once focused on noble ideals of leadership and camaraderie, began to reshape itself into an intricate and cold structure of unrelenting rationalization and extreme pragmatism. His thoughts, once directed towards the collective well-being of his companions and shared glory, now morbidly revolved around a single objective, the realization of his kingdom, his supreme ascent, at any cost, regardless of the sacrifices of others. Facts, statements, and attitudes observed during this period revealed a disturbing shift. He began to see people not as individuals with hopes and dreams, but as mere pieces on a complex chessboard, disposable instruments to achieve his ultimate and grandiose vision. To enter Griffith's mind at this stage, it's crucial to understand the selective dehumanization he adopted, a psychological defense mechanism that allowed him to emotionally distance himself. He no longer saw his companions as human beings with whom he had emotional ties, but rather as sacrificial elements for a greater good, his own grand destiny, the sole truth in his distorted universe. His rhetoric became increasingly centered on his own importance, his predestination, and the necessary sacrifice for his ascension. A scientific analogy for this brutal change would be the process of neural pruning, where less useful or efficient synaptic connections are eliminated to strengthen those that are more relevant to a specific goal. In Griffith's mind, emotional ties, ethical considerations, and empathy became mere obstacles to be painfully removed, allowing the path to absolute power to be cleared. This new way of thinking was not impulsive or emotional, but rather a cold, detached, and calculating logic, where the ultimate goal of his dream categorically justified all means, no matter how terrible. He was, in essence, constructing a new internal value system, where the realization of his kingdom was the supreme and unquestionable law, the sole metric of his worth. However, despite all this dark restructuring, the true purpose, the most terrifying dimension of his ambition, was still dormant, awaiting the opportune moment to awaken. The culminating moment, the watershed that would seal Griffith's destiny and transform not only him but the very fabric of reality around him, finally arrived. This was not a simple miscalculation or an impulsive failure, but a deliberate, conscious, and irreversible choice, a dive without return into a new dimension of power and existence. To reach the apex of his ambition, to transcend his mortal form and ascend to a higher plane of existence, Griffith made a choice that placed him beyond any known moral or ethical limit. He made the definitive transition to a state where compassion, empathy, and humanity itself were considered despicable weaknesses, mere remnants of a past he was fiercely determined to leave behind. His worldview became radically different, almost alien in its coldness. Extreme individualism and the pursuit of self-glorification, even if it meant the annihilation of those who loved him, were the only valid and logical paths. Morality, for him, was an illusory social construct, a tool forged by the weak to control the strong. Griffith began to operate on a plane where rationalization was his unwavering compass, justifying his most atrocious actions as the inevitable and necessary price for the realization of a higher destiny, a future that only he could shape. He saw himself not as a cruel executioner, but as a predestined catalyst of a new era, a superior being who was simply following the path laid out for him. This transition to the point of no return leads us to a disturbing and profoundly uncomfortable dilemma. What if, from Griffith's perspective, his actions, however terrible they may seem to us, were the only logical and inevitable path to realize his vision? What if the pursuit of power that transcends all human limitations, that elevates him above the fragility of mortal existence, is the true and supreme form of freedom? This perspective forces us to question the very nature of ambition, the sanity behind the greatest aspirations, and how far they can take us, disfiguring the soul. What is the true price of freedom when it demands the annihilation of everything one holds dear and has built? The question that echoes is disturbing and without easy answer. Delving deeper into the psychological analysis of Griffith, his behavior can be understood through the lens of pathological narcissism taken to the extreme, where the grandiose and inflated self overrides any consideration for others, becoming the sole priority. His logic was not irrational in the sense of common madness, it was, in fact, hyperrational and mercilessly efficient, focused exclusively on his grandiose goals, with the systematic elimination of any emotional or moral variable that could impede him. It wasn't an insane mind, but a perverse internal coherence, where the pursuit of absolute dominion and the realization of his dream were the sole truth, the only compass. We can draw striking parallels with studies on the psychology of power, which indicate how the possession of great authority and the absence of moral restraints can corrode empathy and lead to inhumane decisions. Griffith, at this stage of his evolution, operated with cold, detached cognition, where the ability to process information logically, strategically, and devoid of emotion was maximized to the extreme, while emotional intelligence and the capacity to connect with the suffering of others were suppressed or atrophied. This was not delusion, it was a form of cold, dehumanized calculation, a mastery in manipulating reality and expectations for his own benefit. Comparatively, we can observe historical figures or even other fictional characters who, in their ascent to power, exhibited this same radical distortion of values. The unwavering belief in a higher destiny, the conviction of being the chosen one, combined with the ability to completely disregard the consequences of their actions on others, is a recurring pattern. For Griffith, the end justified the means, and the realization of his dream, the edifice of his utopian kingdom, was the only metric of success, the only value that mattered, regardless of the trail of sacrifice left behind. There was no room for remorse, only for the relentless march toward glory. What remains after Griffith's ascension and reinvention is a radically transformed world, a landscape that is now a silent and imposing testament to the absolute power of an unyielding will. His kingdom, built on the rubble of his own humanity and the sacrifice of his companions, is a living monument to his boundless ambition, concrete proof that determination can shape reality itself. The surrounding landscape was molded not only by his military and political conquests, but by the very nature of his psychological transformation, by his ascent to a new plane of existence. Griffith's aura, which once inspired hope and loyalty, now emanated an unquestionable, almost divine authority, a presence that dominated everything and everyone. The consequences of his choices reverberate throughout the new world, permeating every aspect of life and impacting the destiny of all who surround him. His presence now defined the new order, the new law, and his influence extended far beyond the physical borders of his kingdom, becoming an omnipresent shadow, an inescapable driving force. What seemed like a utopia to some, was for others a constant reminder of a terrible sacrifice. This complex and dark narrative invites us to a profound and, at times, uncomfortable philosophical reflection. Who are we, mere mortals, to judge the choices of someone who sought the freedom of their own destiny with such intensity and, at a certain point, with such coldness? What truly defines monstrosity? Is it the complete absence of empathy, or is it the pursuit of a power so vast and grand that it annihilates any trace of individuality and morality? Griffith's story, throughout his ascent, transcends the mere narrative of a villain and becomes a modern myth, a timeless parable about the overwhelming cost of greatness and the thin line between vision and destruction. But perhaps, he wasn't the last to walk this dark path, and human nature will continue to generate figures willing to pay the ultimate price for their own reinvention. Griffith's saga, in its dark grandeur, has left us with a disturbing and undeniable truth: ambition, when devoid of moral limits and controlled by a mind that detaches itself from humanity, can reshape the very essence of a being, transforming the brightest of dreams into a calculated and merciless nightmare. We then ask ourselves, is the pursuit of absolute control over one's own destiny and reality a supreme liberation or a cosmic prison, a total isolation? His legacy echoes through time, a somber and imposing reminder that history's greatest achievements can arise from the deepest and most painful of transformations. Paradise has a price, and the soul, a cost that few are willing to pay.